This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Miscellaneous Essays by Thomas de Quincey. The English Mail Coach, or The Glory of Motion. Part 1. Some 20 or more years before I matriculated at Oxford, Mr. Palmer, MP for Bath, had accomplished two things, very hard to do on our little planet, the Earth, however cheap they may happen to be held by the eccentric people in comets. He had invented mail coaches, and he had married the daughter of a duke. Footnote regarding the daughter. Lady Madeline Gordon. End of footnote. He was, therefore, just twice as great a man as Galileo, who certainly invented or discovered the satellites of Jupiter, those very next things extant to mail coaches in the two capital points of speed and keeping time, but who did not marry the daughter of a duke. These mail coaches, as organized by Mr. Palmer, are entitled to a circumstantial notice from myself, having had so large a share in developing the anarchies of my subsequent dreams, an agency which they accomplished, first through velocity, at that time unprecedented. They first revealed the glory of motion, suggesting, at the same time, an undersense not unpleasurable of possible though indefinite danger. Secondly, through grand effects for the eye between lamplight and the darkness upon solitary roads. Thirdly, through animal beauty and power so often displayed in the class of horses selected for this mail service. Fourthly, through the conscious presence of a central intellect, that, in the midst of vast distances, of storms, of darkness, of night, overruled all obstacles into one steady co-operation and a national result. Footnote regarding vast distances. One case was familiar to mail coach travellers, where two mails in opposite directions, north and south, starting at the same minute from points 600 miles apart, met almost constantly at a particular bridge which exactly bisected the total distance. End of footnote. To my own feeling, this post office service recalled some mighty orchestra, where 1,000 instruments, all disregarding each other, and so far in danger of discord, yet all obedient as slaves to the supreme baton of some great leader, terminate in a perfection of harmony like that of heart, veins, and arteries, in a healthy animal organization. But finally, that particular element in this whole combination which most impressed myself, and through which it is that to this hour Mr. Palmer's mail coach system tyrannizes by terror and terrific beauty over my dreams, lay in the awful political mission which at that time it fulfilled. The mail coaches it was that distributed over the face of the land, like the opening of apocalyptic vials, the heart-shaking news of Trafalgar, of Salamanca, of Vittoria, of Waterloo. These were the harvests that, in the grandeur of their reaping, redeemed the tears and blood in which they had been sown. Neither was the meanest peasant so much below the grandeur and the sorrow of the times as to confound these battles, which were gradually moulding the destinies of Christendom, with the vulgar conflicts of ordinary warfare, which are oftentimes but gladiatorial trials of national prowess. The victories of England in this stupendous contest rose of themselves as natural Te Deums to heaven, and it was felt by the thoughtful that such victories, at such a crisis of general prostration, were not more beneficial to ourselves than finally to France, and to the nations of Western and Central Europe, through whose pusillanimity it was that the French domination had prospered. The mail coach, as the national organ for publishing these mighty events, became itself a spiritualized and glorified object to an impassioned heart, and naturally, in the Oxford of that day, all hearts were awakened. There were, perhaps, of us gownsmen 2,000 resident in Oxford, and dispersed through 25 colleges. Footnote regarding residence in Oxford. The number on the books was far greater, many of whom kept up an intermitting communication with Oxford; but I speak of those only who were steadily pursuing their academic studies, and of those who resided constantly as fellows. In some of these, the custom permitted the student to keep what are called short terms. That is, the 4 terms of Michaelmas, Lent, Easter, and Act were kept severally by a residence, in the aggregate, of 91 days, or 13 weeks. Under this interrupted residence, accordingly, it was possible that a student might have a reason for going down to his home 4 times in the year. This made 8 journeys to and fro. And as these homes lay dispersed through all the shires of the island, and most of us disdained all coaches except His Majesty's mail, no city out of London could pretend to so extensive a connection with Mr. Palmer's establishment as Oxford. Naturally, therefore, it became a point of some interest with us, whose journeys revolved every 6 weeks on average, to look a little into the executive details of the system. With some of these Mr. Palmer had no concern. They rested upon bye-laws not unreasonable, enacted by posting-houses for their own benefit, and upon others equally stern, enacted by the inside passengers for the illustration of their own exclusiveness. These last were of a nature to rouse our scorn, from which the transition was not very long to mutiny. Up to this time, it had been the fixed assumption of the 4 inside people, as an old tradition of all public carriages from the reign of Charles II, that they, the illustrious quaternion, constituted a porcelain variety of the human race, whose dignity would have been compromised by exchanging 1 word of civility with the 3 miserable Delftware outsides. Even to have kicked an outsider might have been held to attaint the foot concerned in that operation, so that, perhaps, it would have required an Act of Parliament to restore its purity of blood. What words, then, could express the horror, and the sense of treason, in that case which had happened, where all 3 outsides, the trinity of pariahs, made a vain attempt to sit down at the same breakfast table or dinner table with the consecrated 4? I myself witnessed such an attempt, and on that occasion a benevolent old gentleman endeavoured to soothe his 3 holy associates by suggesting that, if the outsides were indicted for this criminal attempt at the next assizes, the court would regard it as a case of lunacy or delirium tremens, rather than of treason. England owes much of her grandeur to the depth of the aristocratic element in her social composition. I am not the man to laugh at it. But sometimes it expressed itself in extravagant shapes. The course taken with the infatuated outsiders, in the particular attempt which I have noticed, was, that the waiter, beckoning them away from the privileged salle à manger, sang out, "This way, my good men," and then enticed them away off to the kitchen. But that plan had not always answered. Sometimes, though very rarely, cases occurred where the intruders, being stronger than usual, or more vicious than usual, resolutely refused to move, and so far carried their point as to have a separate table arranged for themselves in a corner of the room. Yet if an Indian screen could be found ample enough to plant them out from the very eyes of the high table, or dais, it then became possible to assume as a fiction of law that the 3 Delft fellows, after all, were not present. They could be ignored by the porcelain men, under the maxim that objects not appearing and not existing are governed by the same logical construction. Such now being, at that time, the usages of mail coaches, what was to be done by us of young Oxford? We, the most aristocratic people, who were addicted to the practice of looking down superciliously even upon the insides themselves as often very suspicious characters, were we voluntarily to court indignities? If our dress and bearing sheltered us, generally, from the suspicion of being raff, the name at that period for snobs, we really were such constructively, by the place we assumed. If we did not submit to the deep shadow of eclipse, we entered at least the skirts of its penumbra. Footnote regarding snobs. And its antithesis, knobs, arose among the internal fractions of shoemakers perhaps 10 years later. Possibly enough, the terms may have existed much earlier, but they were then first made known, picturing